So on Monday we had a lot of information to digest, and it was a lot of information in a very small space. So today, having ingested or part ingested some of that information, I think we can go a little more slowly and just take our time and sort of get to know a bit more about Middle English, how it looks and sounds and things like that. So today is the language of Chaucer, the first big, great English poet. Prior to Chaucer, poets weren't really mentioned. They didn't have prestige. If you'd read a poem, you'll find that, for example, a number of Old English and the majority of Old English and Middle English poems, we don't know who the authors were. It wasn't prestigious to be a poet. In Chaucer's day, however, this changes. When poems start having names attached to them. Partly this is because of the influence of continental models or continental ideas of poetry, in particular from Italy. But we'll come to that. We'll look at some of Chaucer's translations as we go through. So, he was born probably around 1340, died 1400. He was a Londoner, so that tells us about his dialect. He'll be using the London dialect, and the London dialect in this period has a kind of East Midlands inflection to it. He did a number of things. I mean, you couldn't just be a poet, obviously. That didn't pay. So he was a page in a royal household. He was an ambassador. He travelled abroad. He travelled to France and Spain and Italy, where he read the works of other poets. In terms of French poetry, would not have been a massive problem anyway, because French poetry would have been read and known at court. And we're going to look at some of Chaucer's use of French syntax in a bit. He was born in the Vintry Ward, which is quite important because the Vintry Ward in London is where all the Italians lived. And Chaucer is the first person to introduce the big Italian poets into English, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio. So you've got a prime situation there. Also later on, he became customs controller. Basically, he was in charge of wool. It doesn't sound like the most exciting job in the world, being in charge of wool, but it was. Because you deal with lots of different merchants, and wool was a lot of English income was dependent upon this, so he'd have to go and make trade deals and things like that. So the London dialect was mentioned on Monday. It's a form of the southern dialect. It's a particular form which early on was influenced by the West Midlands accent, or dialect rather, and later on was influenced by the East Midlands dialect. So often people say that Chaucer has an East Midlands dialect, but it's really the London dialect. Now he's most famous for his Canterbury Tales, of course. The various figures, those encapsulations of 14th century life, of late medieval life. But he writes a number of verses before this. Courtly poetry, originally in the French style. And again, this affects how he uses language, how he uses syntax, how he uses grammar. So possibly his earliest works actually are some poems which we think are attributed to him. They're just signed CH, and they're written Italian-French. Which is very interesting, considering that Chaucer is the father of English poetry. So after that you get the Romaunt of the Rose, which is a translation of the famous French poem, Le Roman de la Rose. And following that you get the Book of the Duchess. Again, it's a French allegorical dream poem. The House of Fame, which is a bit of a shift, because you notice these two dates. The Book of the Duchess is written by 1372. The House of Fame is written around 1379. Now this is interesting because around 1373-74, Chaucer goes to Italy. He also goes back again in 1378. Again, both times on kind of ambassadorial missions, so representative of the court. But it's important because this is where he finds Italian poetry. And again, we'll see the influence of that on how he writes and how later authors would follow, sort of Chaucer's use of English. After that, Parliament of Fowls, which has got some French and Italian influence in it. Troilus and Cressida is very much an Italian-inflected poem. It's a translation or an adaptation of a poem by Giovanni Boccaccio called Il Filostrato. And the big one, the Canterbury Tales, which are written over a long period. Some of them would have been written earlier, some of them later, which is probably, again, in the Italian fashion. Again, probably following Boccaccio. So what we see from this is, although he's writing in this London dialect, there's a lot of continental influence. And it's important for understanding of Chaucer's works to see this influence in action. And in the sort of the worksheet section of the seminar, you get to have a practice at that. Sort of looking at, even if you don't know Italian and French, you can have a bit of a play. I can think of at least one person in the room who definitely knows French, so you've got an advantage there. So, again, the sort of foreign influences. 25% of the vocabulary was French, which is, again, it's a quarter, it's a large amount. And you notice these words again and again. Gouvernance, plaisance, par amour. Grammatical words and pronouns, prepositions are usually coming from Old English, except they, them, their are coming from Old Norse. They, Chaucer uses quite a bit. Them and their really only appear in the Reeve's Tale, in the Canterbury Tales. And we'll see why that's important, because the Reeve Tale is in a kind of mock northern accent. So it's Chaucer imitating the northern dialect. It's one of the things that we'll look at in a bit more detail. So he was named by Eustace Deschamps, Grand Translateur, Noble Geoffroy Chaucer. Although, so the great translator, noble Geoffrey Chaucer. And it's important to stress that role of translation in Chaucer's writings, the presence of outside influences in Chaucer's writing. So, although Chaucer himself being sort of quite self-effacing, as he often is in his works, he says, "Inam botelud compilator." I just put things together, basically. I compile things. I'm not a great poet. This is all I do. So, although that's the kind of thing you get quite often in writing of this period, sort of, it's called the false modesty topos, where people say, "Oh no, I'm not really good," and then go on to do something really good. So Chaucer translated, adapted, or drew upon famous French poets of the period, Froissart, Marchand, Deschamps, Demeun, and Delors, Italian poets, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, and also Latin texts, so Ovid, Virgil, and Boethius. So again, you can see the number of influences coming into English at this point. It's almost a kind of history of what has been happening so far. So in Chaucer, you've got Old English and Old Norse grammar. You've got influence of Latin with the influence of French and the influence of Italian, which is this newer element. So there's a lot going on. And this comes to be the father of English poetry, so it's kind of a paradigm of what English as a language is, by taking in all these different influences. The prioress exemplifies in her tale, or this is the prologue to her tale, or rather her description in the general prologue, describing the prioress. Now the prioress would have to be someone who is given respect. She's fairly high up, but she doesn't speak proper French, so she's almost playing at it. And French she spake full fire and fetisly after the skull of Stratford at a boar, for French of Paris was to her unknown. So she's got a particular sort of anglicised form of French, Anglo-Norman dialect. She doesn't know the French of Paris. So there's a kind of distinction being made here. And Chaucer did know French, because he's the Grand Translateur. As an example of Chaucer's translation and how certain words enter into English, I've given you a bit here from the poem Les de Confort by Masha. And there's Chaucer's translation of it in the Book of the Duchess. You can see right there where the keywords are, or rather the cog